Minister, there is an appalling legacy of successive governments in underfunding the education sector, and it is that political refusal that has led to our schools becoming over-reliant on parental funding to bridge unacceptable gaps. Primary and post-primary education in this state is intended to be free under constitution and legislation, but the reality is profoundly different. The results of this are parents scrimping, saving, cutting back on everyday essential items, and students losing out and being excluded. The OECD Education at a Glance report last October stated clearly that Ireland lags way behind when it comes to investing in education as a measure of GDP. That is beyond shameful, and it is an issue that is raised with me time and time again by all stakeholders in education that I engage with. Teacher unions are again highlighting the need for urgent additional investment. Barnardo's, the Irish League of Credit Union, St Vincent de Paul, they are all saying the same thing. Education is rapidly becoming an unrealistic cost, and schools are struggling to keep doors open and lights on in warm classrooms. For many in our community, these education costs are a bigger worry this year as the cost of living continues. As rents, mortgages, fuel, utility and food bills get higher and higher, more families will struggle to meet what can be eye-watering costs. And there are things that government can do, and there are things government must do to ease the pressure on parents and students, but you need to act now. As a government, you can and should be doing more in relation to back-to-school costs. You can and should extend the school book scheme to post-primary schools, to take that one meaningful step at least to ease the financial burden on parents of post-primary students who are worried about back-to-school costs now, and the month of June has not yet passed. Free education is a myth, and the issue here now is becoming one of equality. For parents and students at all levels, but particularly post-primary, the return to school is fast approaching, and already they are trying to budget for those additional costs, from everything from uniforms to devices, from books to transport. And then on top of that, parents are asked to pay hundreds of euros in so-called voluntary contributions because of that legacy of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael's failure to properly fund our schools. And each and every one of those costs, Minister, will be felt sharply, putting already hard-pressed parents in the avoidable difficult positions. The most recent Irish League of Credit Union Back-to-School Cost Survey found funding back-to-school continues to be a challenge for parents, with 66% saying that covering the cost of back-to-school is a financial burden. Parents don't use words like that lightly. Parents don't say things like that lightly. And school books remains one of the most expensive items for parents of post-primary children, with an average associated cost per pupil of approximately €210. The Sinn Féin motion this evening is calling on you to cancel the planned increase in student contribution charges and to expand the school book grant scheme to secondary schools in Budget 2024. We have long called for the introduction of free school books for all school children for many, many years, because they are one of those most expensive items that parents have in that annual cost, because they are essential to learning. And where there is a substantial cost, meeting that cost becomes a barrier to education, as has been shown in repeated findings, the Irish League of Credit Unions and others. While you have moved somewhat in Budget 2023 in relation to school books for primary schools, inexcusably you chose not to extend this measure to post-primary, where school books cost significantly more. Now, we in Sinn Féin believe that education must be genuinely free and accessible to all. That means starting at expanding the school book scheme to post-primary schools and stopping the increase for the third-level student contribution.
Ara, I believe it was Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, where it was said that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Well, I wonder if William Shakespeare was a student studying in Irish University today, would he say that student fees by any other name still stink? Because that is what we have. a situation whereby post-crash student fees were branded as a charge, a solution which tries to rebrand the problem, doesn't actually solve anything. It just tries to define it away. And Minister, the reason that I remember this is because I was in college at that time. And I remember because at that time I protested along with so many other students at this charge. And the reason that we protested against it was because we knew that this would lead to the blocking of certain people into third-level education. We knew it then, and we still know it now. And just today, Minister, I spoke to students, and they couldn't believe how much these student contribution charges have actually increased since that time. Because of ARA, what so many students now know from that time, and the people that went through university know, that often what happens is these charges increase, and increase. And I'm a firm believer in actually having access to education for everybody, that there's free education for every single person that wants to access that education. Now, not everybody needs to go into third-level education, and it's really important that we make it clear to students the different options that they have. But see, for anybody who does want to go and access third-level education, well, there should be no such barrier as this contribution charge or any other kind of charges that limits their possibility to access third-level education, that limits their ability to access whatever career path that they want to do. They call us the land of saints and scholars. Well, it shouldn't be a situation where scholars can only be scholars if they have the money to do so. It should be a situation that anybody who wants to access a certain third-level education degree can do so and has the right to do so. Because what we have at the moment is that there are young people who are simply locked out of education. And the reality is, Minister, the reality is that this government actually recognised this. So last year, when you announced the change of the €1,000 in the student contribution fee, in that sense, you recognised at that point that that wasn't fair. You recognised at that point that we needed to do more for people to be able to access third-level education. And now, well before the current cost of living crisis, I knew, and many of us knew, that this charge was wrong. But at a time when bills are increasing and increasing, when people's mortgages are increasing and increasing, and when even basic food supplies are increasing and increasing, well, then it is absolutely scandalous. The reality is as well, and something that students are saying very clearly to me, is that families need to actually be able to plan. They need to know, okay, so next year or the year after, if we have a situation where we have a child that might want to access third-level education, how do we plan for that? And Minister, you know that the reality of decreasing student fees just simply allows more young people to access that third-level education. And of course, it's not just the charges that have an impact in relation to that. We know from the DCU report in relation to housing that that is an additional barrier to education, when they say that an average of €750 simply isn't reasonable or realistic for so many young people. And I think that we can all agree what is needed here is a situation whereby every single young person that wants to access third-level education can do so and can access the course that they want to. Not only is that better for us as the so-called land of saints and scholars, but it is better for the long-term workforce planning. Ari, an rud atá amach ana rá inniu, na rud amháin, Darish of Hain, Gorosha Fear Havach, Gor a maid shaw, a Haha Miclean, a Ia Kulavin, a Ahru, O Trivila, Rogavila, and Nui Kamuj and Orira, brand new air Gofad Chermach, Kamuj Kinchu, Nachme, Costas Erbe, Legol Huig on trio level, but Horgamach Shegamach, Dina Oganan, Golhuig, Olskolna, Moss Mian Lobe, and Nui Ruddy Ellager Fagina Dina Oga Yena, except Fear Havach, Gomach and Tola Shinakab, a her Nui, Bechor go ein fosh the bio, a ta Giragol, an Olskol, Bechor Gomach Shed, Yesh, and Dina Og Shin, gol agus fólam cébe rud gur bháil ólam. Gomach siad sinan an a rá péin, wa tá mise gur a bheith I mo léachtar, tá mise gur bheith mo gochtar, tá mise gur bheith mo altra, gur féidir lo bei sin fád a dhéine, agus ní chóir gomach sé, nach mo sé de yes acu bei sin dhéine, mar jall nach bhfuil an target sin acu. So, Ministers, I think we are all in agreement. We need to make sure that everybody has access to third-level education that wants to do so.
Thank you, Deputy Paul Donnelly. 2.5 minutes.
Minister, I think the term free education, and we all know, is really a myth at this stage. As we've heard, a staggering 66% of parents find back-to-school costs an additional financial burden. The cost of school books remain high. Elevated student fees, travel and accommodation costs, uniform costs, stationery costs, and the extracurricular activities. And again, which is raised every year constantly, is the issue of iPads. People have to pay €700 for an iPad and have to buy the books at the same time. But are this government listening to parents and guardians? No, they're looking to increase the cost of education again in September 2023. This government must reverse the planned increase of student contributions charges and instead commit to phasing out of fees over the coming years. The USI Cost of College campaign is a prime example of the burden on students and their families in higher education that they have cited accommodation costs, travel costs, student contribution fees as major obstacles to those wishing to continue their education. And I know from meeting students in TU, Blanchardstown, where the cost of accommodation is absolutely crippling them and stopping them from completing their education. From talking directly to apprentices and members, many of them, and members of the USI, many of them also know that poor pay is a major factor in their education, and given the promotion of further education, removing these contribution fees is crucial. With the average cost of school books for parents at €101 per child in primary school and €201 at secondary level, the government can expand the free school book grant scheme to secondary schools in budget 2024. Education must be genuinely free and accessible to all.
I welcome the opportunity to speak on this motion today, which focuses on the need for the government to cut back-to-school costs, and I commend my party colleagues, Deputy Clark and Deputy Farrell, on their work in bringing this forward. I mean, the letters and the emails and the texts have already gone out from schools requesting the purchase of books and uniforms, as well as seeking the voluntary contributions that are anything but voluntary from families. And numerous families I've spoken to feel like this is a huge burden. They feel it's a burden every year, but particularly with the current cost of living crisis, it has now become unbearable. And we know that many families are being forced to take out loans or indeed go to charities to cover the back-to-school costs. And schools should not feel the need to have to fundraise or ask for voluntary contributions. I mean, the government need to fund the education system adequately to cover basic costs. And schools are put in this position because of the government's failure to invest. I mean, school books remain probably the most expensive item for parents in terms of annual back-to-school costs. And something has to be done to ease that financial burden on parents. The free school book scheme, it could and should be expanded to secondary schools in budget 24. I'd like to see that happening. It's welcome in primary schools this year, very welcome, but it needs to happen in secondary schools as well. And we know many secondary schools have book rental arrangements in place, and they do reduce costs quite considerably. But I know of one family who have a first-year start in school, and they've been asked for €300, and that's to cover book rental for the first 3 years. And you might think, right, that's not too bad over a 3-year period, but they have to pay it up front, and I'm sure it actually includes a voluntary contribution. For a fifth-year student, which is a 2-year course, they've been asked for €330. That's a lot of money for parents to come up with, especially where they have more than one student starting maybe in first year and in fifth year, and to have to pay out over €600 just to see their students start or their children start in the school. As a former teacher as well, I believe something needs to be done about school book publishers excessively revising their textbooks and forcing families and schools to purchase books every few years when it's entirely unnecessary. Incredibly, the government is in effect increasing student fees this September for third level because they haven't properly funded third-level institutions and are forcing them to raise their student contribution charge. I mean, the charge was put in place in the aftermath of the financial crisis as a means for third-level institutions to offset government reductions to their core funding. But there's a pattern arising here where parents and students have to fill the gap left by government reducing core funding to educational institutions. And instead of seeing an increase in these contributions, the government needs instead to put in place adequate funding and commit to phasing out fees over the coming years. Educational institutions must be properly resourced so that they do not have to rely on contributions of any kind, and education must be genuinely free and accessible to all. Thank you, Chair.
Deputy Quinlivan, 2.5 minutes.
Minister, as schools across the country close their doors for the summer, parents, teachers and students themselves can look forward to a well-earned break and some recovery before the cycle starts again in late August. I salute our primary, post-primary and third-level educators for the work and support they have offered our learners over the last academic year. Being an educator is a tough, but I'm sure a very rewarding job at the same time. But as the summer approaches its conclusion, school book lists will be issued, school uniform requirements will be provided, and parents will once again be faced with the daunting task of paying for these necessities while struggling with the ongoing costs of living crisis that we're all involved in. The burden of these costs weigh heavily on parents, and according to the League of Irish Credit Unions, 66% of parents are saying that covering the cost of schools is a significant financial burden to them. The government has made some strides by introducing a free school book scheme for primary schools, but they should have and can go further. This needs to be expanded to secondary schools, where school book costs are an even more significant expense. A Bernardo report notes that the average cost of school books for secondary school students is €201. As my colleague, our Deputy Tully said, if you have more than one child, then obviously you can double that or triple that. Added to this, the cost of uniforms, the cost of transport, the cost of post-school activities, and a huge financial burden is incurred by parents. The government can alleviate some of these pressures, but they need to act now. For the parents of school children, they must alleviate the burden of school book costs and supposed voluntary contributions to individual schools. These contributions and book requirements hit parents all at once at the same time to start a new term and puts a burden on parents and children across the state. The financial costs and pressures doesn't end when the leaving certificate is completed. If a young adult decides to go to third level, more financial burdens is faced. The student contribution charge is a huge expense and is not means tested. While it can be reimbursed for some by application to SUSI, it remains a significant cost. During this oppressive cost of living crisis, the government intends to increase this charge. Workers and families are struggling to pay their housing costs, their utility bills and their increased grocery costs. It just isn't good enough to add further burdens to these families. These planned increases in student contribution charges should be cancelled, and these fees should be reduced and ultimately eliminated. Furthermore, in the upcoming budget, the government should commit to expanding the school back to school to secondary schools and work towards making a free education system genuinely free and ease the pressure on students and parents. Creating a genuinely free education system is achievable. It can be done.
Thanks, Ciara. This year, the cost of education, Minister, and I'm glad to see that the two ministers are here, is a bigger worry for families as we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. And there are certain things that government can do and must do to ease that pressure on parents and students. At primary and secondary level, not only do parents face the expensive cost of school books, with the average cost of €200 plus, but they're also expected to make voluntary contributions. And these can be in the region of €200 plus in some cases. They have to pay for transition year fees, find money for extracurricular activities, and of course the annual cost of uniforms. And on top of that, in rural areas, school transport, which there's a charge for, reduced charge, but still there. But some have to arrange transport through private bus companies. I know of several cases in Laois and Offaly where people are getting their children to school via private bus hire, which runs into huge figures every year. So year on year, we're seeing requests for voluntary contributions of well over €100 and €200 plus in some cases per child. And there's significant pressure on families to contribute, with real stigma attached for the pupils if the contribution isn't made. And the reason this is happening in the first place is due to the lack of funding from the department. The school capitation grant, Minister, has to be dealt with in this budget, particularly at primary level. We can't continue doing it on the cheap. The cost of heating, the cost of insurance, all of our overhead costs at primary schools, and you'll know that as a teacher yourself, has gone up in recent years. According to the most recent survey from the legal credit unions, that back to school survey, the funding continues to be a huge headache for parents, with that over 2/3 saying that covering the costs is a major financial burden for them. We're calling on the government to expand the free book scheme to secondary schools to ease that financial burden on parents during that difficult period. At third level, education fields now pose a potential barrier to education, and it's totally unacceptable that that can happen, because the right to third level education should be there regardless of what strata children come from. So the government should not consider increasing student fees this September, and that must be stopped. So we're calling on the government to cancel that planned increase. We're calling on them to increase the capitation grant over the next budget. We're committed for our part to ending the voluntary contributions by increasing the capitation grants. Minister, to conclude, parents with children going back to school in September are facing huge financial pressures. Government must act now, not in 3 months' time, to ease that burden.
Ministers, parents rightly question the notion of free education at this time of year. The Irish League of Credit Unions back-to-school survey costs shows that 66% of parents see back-to-school costs as a financial burden. Costs increase across the board year on year as schools look for higher voluntary contributions because the system is being underfunded by government. It's crazy to think that parents continue to pick up the state's tab to the tune of 40 or 50 million euros a year. Now, Minister, I want to raise with you a woman in my own constituency. She has 2 children attending secondary school, and she has a 3rd starting in September. The books for all her 3 children are coming in at over 500 euros. On top of the books, the child who's entering 1st year needs to get an iPad, which is coming in at over 700 euros. The uniform is costing her 200 euros. For that woman, the total cost of her 3 children going back to secondary school in September is over 1,400 euros before a voluntary contribution or school fees come in. I also have another lady contact me, Minister, and she says that she's 2 young children in primary school and her uniforms are costing her 160 euros. And she says that's before she has to pay voluntary school contributions and stationery and other school fees. Now, simple cost-saving measures like generic uniforms had been talked for years by all different ministers, but nothing has ever come on that. Now, while Minister, I acknowledge that you brought in free school books for primary school children in the last budget, I think it really needs to be brought in for secondary schools too. An increase in the student contribution charge for 3rd level is on the way. And as if 3rd level students weren't struggling enough, Minister, the government needs to scrap these increases and show compassion towards hard-pressed students. It's time the government funded education properly and worked towards making education really and truly free.
Martin Brown.
Minister, the current cost of living crisis is having a profound effect on many families in Ireland. Inflation is impacting on how far family budgets can stretch. While measures to bring inflation down, primarily being undertaken by the ECB and interest rate hikes, is adding to the outcomes for mortgage holders. For those renting, the costs are significant and in many cases bear little relation to the ability of families to put a roof over their heads while providing for their needs. With pressures like these, the fundamental right to education should not be further factor in the increasing pressures on families. And indeed, when it comes to 3rd level, the undergraduate themselves, who will in many instances be faced with the very same high rental costs and increased living expenses. Times are not easy, and this must be recognised in the government's treatment of the cost incurred in education. Traditionally, school books have been among the most expensive items for parents when it comes to the cost of going back to school. As a party, we have long argued for school books to be provided free of charge because successive governments have resisted this. The pressure on families got to such a stage that some families now have to cut back on other household spending to allow for the spend on school books, as if things weren't bad enough for struggling families. For many families, the approximate cost of €101 per child on primary school books is not easily come by. For families sending their kids to secondary school, this bigger source of 200, which again cannot be allowed to continue. And Minister, that's not Sinn Féin or members of the left or the opposition over here. That's Bernardo's report, which is backed up by the Irish League of Credit Unions. It's them that's saying this. And at the moment, the Taoiseach is trying to make hay out of the proposed tax cuts. But if he would put the taxes already paid by the people of Ireland to work for their benefit, he may actually make a difference for struggling families. Furthermore, we are calling on this government to abandon its plans to increase the student contribution charge, which I might remind the Minister has put in place to offset the reduction in core funding that occurred during times of austerity. When third-level students are faced with rent prices never encountered before by students, and when families are most limited in their ability to support them, we really need to see the planned increase in the fees ditched. And furthermore, this government must publish its plan to eliminate student fees for the coming years. The government makes much of the current employment figures. It speaks of how the knowledge base of our young workers contributes to this in no small way. But if you truly value this knowledge base and the skills that make us an attractive place in which to do business, you must do all you can to ensure cost is not a barrier to accessing further and higher education, while giving the families of primary and secondary students the opportunity to know that at the start of the school year, school book costs will not yet again become another significant hit on household finances. For Margaret, let's call her.
I'm very glad to hear that you won't be opposing our motion, and because our asks are quite straightforward, and we put them to you this evening, Minister, on behalf of the people across North Kildare and Leixlip, Selbridge, Maynooth, Naas, who are already struggling with a vicious series of mortgage rate hikes, exorbitant rents and a deep cost of living crisis. Even to get out your front door now to get a few bits and pieces for the back to school, you're not talking about a 10 or 20 euro note. You won't get much change out of 50. The days of the tenors and £20 notes to get the rubber in your pencil case and all that for kids getting back to school are long gone. The school year isn't even over yet for primary kids, and too many parents are already worried about September and the cost of free education that is anything but. The so-called voluntary contribution is a source of involuntary mortification for a lot of parents who simply can't afford it. And I hear what you say, Minister, but the schools where the parents can't afford to pay the voluntary contribution are the schools that really need that extra help. And unless you're making up that voluntary contribution, it's no use saying to parents that it's a voluntary contribution, that they don't have to pay it if they don't want to. And the government really needs to fund public education properly so parents aren't expected to plug that gap out of their personal pocket when they're feeling that pressure. In June, the children, they're already squashed into their trousers, they're riding up their legs, their jumpers are bet onto them, their shirts, because parents don't want to be buying uniforms. Well, they're expecting a growth spurt from their kids over the summer. By extending the free book scheme and by proposing a ban on fee increases on third level, our plan gives hard-working people a financial hand, not another financial wallop. And there seems to be even worse when there's that naked political indifference. And that's what people are saying to me, that they feel that there's an indifference in government about how hard they're finding things. And we hear it all the time. My salary isn't going nowhere. It's not going far enough. And there's no room for the basics even, never mind the extras. So it's not acceptable that so-called free education should be so expensive for the people who are already funding it with their taxes and their work. So I appreciate your accepting the motion, but...
Good. Minister, each year parents are finding the back-to-school costs have increased from the previous year and are putting them under greater financial pressure. In a society where education is supposed to be free, parents are finding that putting even just one child through school can cost thousands of euros. If parents are putting 2 or more children through school, they are finding that the financial burden is becoming unsustainable. Many families are left in a very precarious financial position, trying to sustain the cost of the children's education need over the long term. They find that they are having to make more and more sacrifices as children progress through from primary to secondary and finally to third level education. Research shows that costs incurred for children in secondary school is almost double that of a child in primary school. Studies carried out by Bernardo's have found that many parents have had to cut back on a range of costs, which have included paying some bills so that they can meet the costs of a child returning to school. Estimates show that for 2022 it costs €1,146 to keep their child in primary education. The highest spends were on transport, followed by after-school activities, school lunches and school books. It costs on average for 2022 $1,838 to send a child to secondary school. The highest cost for a child going to secondary school includes transport, lunches and grinds. In a cost of living crisis, the very least we should expect is that our children receive a proper education without parents foregoing the payment of bills or getting into debt to cover the cost of the child education. Education is a fundamental right, and our children need the best start in life. To help them on their path and to ease the pressure on parents, the free school book scheme should be expanded to include secondary schools. I've seen the benefits for a child having a hot meal, and it allows them to remain focused during class and get the very best out of their learning. Transport remains one of the highest costs in education, so it is essential that the school transport scheme is expanded, benefiting families who stand to make substantial financial savings at a time when most families are struggling financially. Now is the time to implement these measures so that parents preparing for the new school year in September have peace of mind and less of the stress around sending a child back to school. Thank you.
Chair, thank you. I want to commend Deputy Clerk Clark for bringing forward this motion, and Deputy Mairead Farrell. The summer months are for parents meant to be a very positive time, a time that you spend with your family and your children and you make good memories. But unfortunately, for a lot of parents, the summer months is a very stressful, worrying time, because you are looking to September and you are looking at the lists coming in terms of uniforms, in terms of workbooks and so on, in terms of textbooks at secondary school, and at third level fees. And at this time, there are parents right now who are trying to figure out how they're going to first get through the summer, but secondly, pay for these bills. And there are many, unfortunately, who will end up going to moneylenders and illegal moneylenders with extortionate interest rates, and would put themselves under very, very severe pressure. And we know from the Irish League of Credit Unions that 66% say that covering the costs of back to school is a very severe financial burden. You listen to organisations like St Vincent de Paul, and it's one of their busiest times of the year, is that they are getting enormous amounts of phone calls for things that are essential, because every parent wants to ensure that their child has the ability to access a decent education. We are supposed to have a system where primary and post-primary education is free. The reality is that is a myth. It is not free. It is anything but. Now, I will acknowledge the steps forward that have been taken in relation to free school books at primary level, but I will also say that that is something that was being campaigned on by this side of the House and by organisations like the St Vincent de Paul and the Irish League of Credit Unions for years, if not decades. We are 3/4 of a century behind the North in relation to free school books. So while it's welcome, it certainly is a long time coming, and we need to see it at post-primary. But there are also other very significant costs that we haven't made any progress on. Uniforms is a huge one that will probably require different forms of legislation. I have tabled such pieces of legislation, and the government has not worked with them. But similarly, in relation to voluntary contributions, the government not only didn't support, but voted to delay and delay again our bill to tackle voluntary contributions. That is a huge cost for families. So if the government is serious, it needs to start supporting piece of legislation the opposition brings forward to cut costs.
Deputy, all right.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach, and I want to commend Deputies Mairead Farrell and Sorcha Clark for this motion. Minister, we're all aware of the link between poverty and low educational attainment. It is the job of government to even out that playing field. Barriers like the high cost of school books, the cost of uniforms, they cause hardship, they impact on a student's ability to learn and a teacher's ability to teach. Minister, St Catherine's School in Rush does not have DEIS status. The only secondary school in the town has DEIS status, but the two feeder primary schools don't. This makes absolutely no sense. And a member of the school community contacted me And she had this to say. She said, there are children in St Catherine's that are hungry every day. Some don't have uniforms, and if they do, they are in very poor condition as they've been passed down from siblings or relatives or friends. One child came in with his trousers stapled together last week before a staff member got to the shop and got him a new pair. The children are at a massive educational disadvantage before they even walk in the door to try to learn. How can you learn if you're hungry? How can you learn if the uniform you're wearing doesn't fit, if it isn't clean, so your friends won't sit beside you because you're smelly? I could go on to list all the school tours they'll never go on, the museums they'll never get to see because we can't afford the bus, the popcorn parties that they're not getting as treats because I spend so much on bringing in lunches to some children daily that I cannot afford to subsidise treats and trips to. Their childhoods are slipping away quickly. Just down the road, Gael School Rotto is losing a teacher, which will mean that class sizes will increase as classes are amalgamated. This isn't right in a growing town, and I would ask you, Minister, to please engage with your colleague to please examine this serious issue. It is very welcome that you are not opposing our motion, but we need to see more action to level up the playing field for kids. So please support our motion. Don't just say that you won't oppose it. Support the motion. Take on board the constructive suggestions that Sinn Féin have made that will make a real difference in the lives of kids who, from the day they were born, are at a disadvantage. And education is the one thing. My grandmother always said it. She said it is no burden to carry. Get as much education as you can. But we need to acknowledge it is not easy for families. In the middle of a cost of living crisis, we need to be pulling every lever and ensuring every bit of support goes to families.
Deputy.
Look, I want to echo what my colleague Deputy O'Reilly has said there and the need to actually support this motion, Minister. Education is the last great equaliser of society. And yes, it is no load to bear, but the opportunities that it presents, particularly to those who are born into disadvantage, cannot be overestimated. Look, with your indulgence, I want to briefly touch on some comments made by the Minister for Higher Education earlier on. I'm not sure what it was he thought he was doing, perhaps playing to the audience of those he hopes will vote for him in the next Fine Gael election. But if he does think that the parents and the students believe a word that comes out of his mouth, considering how long Fine Gael have been in power for, that they have the solutions to this issue, he is very, very wrong. When I spoke earlier, I spoke of this needing to be a first step. Minister, this needs to be the first step. The primary school or the post-primary school book scheme needs to be a first step. We need to then tackle the capitation grant levels. You mentioned them in your contribution. They're nowhere near the pre-economic crash level, never mind having an increased due to increase in costs since then. Yes, pupil-teacher ratios have come down, but we're still a country mile off where some of our European neighbours are, and those that we should seek to replicate. The summer work scheme, I was in a school recently where the footpath was so crumbled it is now literally a slip and trip hazard for the students and the teachers in that school. Where is that programme at? Where is the ICT grant programme at? The government have introduced a digital strategy, but you're failing to actually resource the schools to be able to deliver an ask that the department is making of them. The same with the AP1 and the AP2 posts. The department has these asks of schools, but you're failing to actually resource the management capabilities within the schools to be able to actually deliver them. Don't get me started on the books of the visually impaired. That is an absolute thundering disgrace that any child should have to wait that length of time to get a book simply because it's in Braille. If there was any other circumstances there, I can guarantee you, Minister, somebody would have taken a legal action against the state. What we also need to drastically improve is the level of intervention therapy services within our schools, particularly speech and language therapies. There is a reason why they are so effective at a particular age and why it is that they get more difficult as the child gets older. We need to have a very honest conversation about the reasonable accommodation scheme for students with disabilities or for students who may need additional supports. I want to give you an example of one comment a principal made to me quite recently, and it involves fish fingers. You know, the frozen fish fingers that come in a box? 2 siblings in that principal's school came to the attention of one of the teachers. Something was a little off in the classroom. One sibling had 1 frozen fish finger in their lunchbox. The other sibling had the other frozen fish finger in their lunchbox. So while you talk about school meals and expanding the school meal programme, you need to look at the school meal programme in its whole. Because while you are expanding it, what you're not doing is increasing the funding directly to the schools to be able to cope with the increased electricity costs where that food is produced on site, or to manage the waste, the additional waste that comes from providing school meals. When you talk about the book grant, the primary school book grant, very welcome as it is indeed, but I'm not the only parent in this country who's got an email from a school saying that it doesn't go far enough. In fact, there was reports that said that it should be in and around €110 a year to actually be effective, because that's the price of what it is. I heard with some level of interest, I'll say, when the Minister spoke of the school transport system last year being a success. Thinking there's a level of amnesia going on here, Minister. The school transport system last year was anything but a success. The only thing in school transport last year that somebody should be commenting on was the absolute disaster of what it was and how they will never stand over that disaster happening again. The unmet demand in school transport, the only thing that equals it is the unpublished review that should have been out by now, because students are going to be reliant on this very much come September. One other issue that I want to raise here, and specifically it is to do again with the voluntary nature of teachers who contribute into schools. That volunteering nature of teachers who give so freely of their time, that's not a never-ending resource. Teachers are not going to work for nothing forever. And at this point, schools are going to have to start asking themselves, do they have the capacity to actually deliver what the department is asking of them without that additional finance being put available? And my colleague, Deputy O'Leary, made a very good remark there earlier on. Sinn Féin introduced the voluntary contribution bill. You kicked it down the road. We introduced a bill around affordable school uniforms. You failed to support that either. Minister, there is a considerable amount of work to be done when it comes to adequately funding education. Don't be so blind to good ideas simply because they don't come from that side of the House.
Thank you, Deputy. That concludes the debate. And now put the question. The question is that the motion be agreed to. Deputies who are in favour, say tá. Tá. Motion is carried.